Okay, hello everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to this event. As you can see, I'm joined by my colleagues Paul Swinney and James Evans. And for the next 30 minutes, we're going to be talking about and reflecting on the government's industrial strategy green paper that was published last week. We're going to assume that you've read it, or at least you have some feeling for it. So we're not going to summarize what's in it, at least not directly. We're just going to be talking about some of the things that struck us when we've looked through it and read it ourselves. And we're going to try and do that in three sections. So in section one, crudely, we're going to look at some of the goods and the not so goods from our perspective. And then in the second bit, we're going to think about the further bits of analysis that we think could go into the paper as it moves from green paper to white paper. And then similarly, the third bit, I think, is just highlighting some of the tensions or some of the issues that probably need to further consideration as we go from green to white. And if you enjoyed today, or you're just particularly interested in all matters of industrial strategy, you can join us in person next Thursday, the 31st of October, in the Shard in the evening. We're going to have an in conversation with Greg Clark, former MP, former Secretary of State for Business and for Communities. That was the architect and leader of the government's last industrial strategy back in 2017. So if you fancy that, you can sign up via our website. It's at the Shard, so you also get a very good view as well. So that's it from me in ways of introduction. Let's get into the details. Paul, you kick us off. What did we like about the industrial strategy? What is it that's in there that we particularly thought was good? And then we'll get on to the not so goods.
Yeah, so there was stuff in there that we would welcome, which was interesting to see. And obviously, this is a green paper, so it's out for consultation. Definitely not the fully formed thoughts of the government. But that leads me on to the first point that we thought was good, was that this has been produced in very quick time. I'm sure a couple of civil servants had to lie down in a darkened room after having produced it in such quick time, but at least it has materialised. And we know from the Levelling Up white paper, which took a number of years to produce, that there were a lot of time that was wasted in terms of trying to put about the strategy. At least they've gone straight into it and said, this is what we think, what do you think? So much to welcome on that. And from a sector perspective, there's a focus on sort of the tradable element of the UK economy, which we mean by things that trade with the rest of the world, rather than focus on what we would describe as non-tradables or local services, so retail, etc., hairdressers and things like that. So that's good that that distinction is being made. From a place perspective, I think there are a number of interesting things that are said in there. Lots of discussion around potential of places reaching their potential. Implicit within that recognises that some places have probably got greater potential than others, which we agree with. Our work underpins that. It recognises the underperformance of big places within that, in particular, big cities like Manchester, Glasgow, Birmingham, etc. But it also notes the importance of London as well within this, which I think is welcome because
brought back in from the cold,
right? Exactly, yeah, come back into the fold, and that is important. London is a big part of our economy, and we do need to be thinking about how we deal with the challenges that it faces, rather than pretending that none of those challenges are there. And certainly in the last 15 years, there have been some significant challenges for London. And then finally, I would say there's quite a degree of continuity from the last industrial strategy too, which some people might say, this is just the same as before. It's not quite, but there's a lot along there. I would say that as a bad thing. But actually, in general, we would say that has been a good thing. I mean, if you believe that industrial strategy is important, and if you think that strategy is supposed to be long-term, then if the last strategy was any good, then this one should look the same as that one, or look very similar to that one. And actually, that there are a number of things that are very similar, I think is something that should be welcomed.
Particularly because it's like politically useful as well. We mentioned Greg Clark. He came out and said, there's good things in here, whatever else. There's some comments in the Commons as well that were broadly warm from the opposition. So as far as having a long-term plan is concerned, that's advantageous, right? You'd hope people be on the same page with something that's this important.
Yeah, and I guess an additional point, which we all know, those of us that are thinking about how to engage with the policy process, is that the Chancellor, as well as the Secretary of State for Business, but the Chancellor was wrote the foreword with the Secretary of State. So there's at least at this point in time, there's a recognition that the Treasury have bought into it.
Yes.
Which we know from previous experiences, that I know people criticize the Treasury for a whole bunch of different things, but if they're not interested in the subject or the issue, and therefore they don't sign up to it, it can guarantee that it doesn't go very far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's past the first hurdle in that respect, got the chances back in.
Yeah, good. And, I think your point, we'll get onto this. I think from our perspective, there was a recognition that an interesting perspective on economic geography, recognizing that there is an economic geography, it does matter, things are not everywhere and they're in places for good reasons, and there's a recognition of that.
And that's developed, I think, over the years too. So if we go back to the industrial strategy under the last Labour government, that was led by Peter Mandelson, place pretty much was absent from that conversation. Go forward to the 2017 one under May, place becomes more of an issue, but I don't think this element of potential really was recognised. It was just, our place has got a role to play and we need growth across the country, was about as far as they went. This is being refined further, perhaps with a local levelling up white paper in between that did a lot of this thinking, taking it through to, right, well, different places do play different roles in the economy. That has implications for how the industrial strategy might play out. That has implications for how we might target resources as well, which is very welcome that thinking is there. I think that strengthens the case for the state-led intervention by understanding that and understanding the theory behind it.
Yeah, and I should have said at the beginning, if you've got your own comments or thoughts on the industrial strategy, or you've got a query or a comment that you want to make after listening to us or during listening to us, then use the Q&A function on the screen as per usual, and we'll have a look and try to answer them as we're going through. When I'm looking down, I'm looking at where the questions are. So bear that in mind. If you've got something you want to offer, please do that. So there's a bunch of goods, and obviously there's more we could say on that. Let's identify some of the things that we are, things to consider. Let's give the government benefit of the doubt. We're at green paper stage, not white paper, and they recognise there's lots more work to be done, and that's quite right. So things that we are just sort of highlighting now that are also on our mind, and we would, we'll look to engage and support the government as it does its thinking. So let's just start us off with those kinds of things.
Yes, and there are a number of things to identify from this. And it is worth us saying that we are looking at this from a place perspective, and obviously that's the angle that we bring to this. So we have more to say on that than say what's been said about energy, for example, where we've just got less to say, and look to others to guide us on that front. Right, things that are a bit of a challenge. The first one is that the goal identified is growth, but there isn't really any definition around what that actually means. Is that output growth? Is it productivity growth? Growth over what period as well? That might sound a bit picky. At least they did say economic growth, what they said was growth, which is a good thing. But really, there's quite a big difference, I think, between what those different things mean. And we've had economic growth over the last 15 years, and living standards haven't budged because productivity growth hasn't changed. I think probably implicitly that's what the government means, but any strategies have a very specific goal stated at the top, and there's no specifics in there at the moment, and that is a weakness that I think will need to be addressed. Second thing, obviously, we've had a lot about place being in there and that being a good thing. There's definitely a sense of reading through it that there's a bit of a disconnect between the sector element and the place element. It's sort of like, we need to talk about sectors, we need to talk about places, but how do those things interact? And I think there's more thinking to be done there, and certainly we've done work on that, and we'll continue to do work on that to show how those two things knit together. Then on the sectors point 3 of probably 4 points I'd like to make. So on that third point, it's not a surprise that sectors are there. It's just, it was ever thus when you talk about industrial strategy, the word industrial is in there. So we feel like we've got to reach for sectors. Again, as I said in the positives, that's quite broad, and focus on that export base is probably quite a good thing. But I think we are quite sceptical of the ability of governments to pick out sectors, because necessarily they can only identify today's sectors, not tomorrow's sectors. The industrial strategy should be about thinking about tomorrow's sectors, which inherently we can't predict. Now, there was a really interesting line in the green paper which pretty much said this. It said the economy today is very different to what it was 10 years ago, and the economy in 10 years' time will look radically different to the way it does today. That's not verbatim, but that's basically what it says, and not far off. And so, well, if we recognise the economy is going to be very different in 10 years' time, why do we think we then predict what those sectors are going to look like in terms of what the growth sectors are? And there's a nervousness about getting too specific on those things, particularly with the sector deals, and right, we're going to do this for this sector and that for that sector, rather than focusing on sort of the broader drivers that are likely to have a bigger play, particularly within certain places of the economy, which in fairness, those wider drivers do get a good showing in the industrial strategy. But as ever, it's the sectors that get the upfront bit. And I think we need to be very careful about that. I think the final thing just to consider is this degree of longevity with this. So I've already said we had an industrial strategy in 2008, 9-ish, in 2017, and now we've got another one now. I think IPPR pulled out the figure about how many growth strategies etc. we'd had since 2010, of which I think it was 11 or 13 or something like that. We've had loads of churn of these types of things, even under the same government, albeit with or same party, albeit with different leaders. And we're sort of told this time that this time is going to be different. It's like, okay, but I'm not sure exactly how it's going to be different. And there's not really a clear sense of that beyond them saying that this is a 10-year plan. I think if we have Labour in power for 10 years, you could see how it might stick around. But if we have a change of government, after 5 years, it's not really sure what is in here currently to make that stick. And if we're not going to go down the same route as the other stuff, which is basically into the recycle bin, what is going to be different about this? I think we need to have some answers around that.
Yeah, it's a good point. And, there's a broader point about, there's been a sort of a revival of industrial strategies and industrial strategy thinking. You can see the US have done this in various ways for a various bunch of reasons. The European Union are doing something similar. So there's a kind of interesting moment as to whether industrial strategy is back in vogue, and does that give us a greater chance that if we have a change of government or change of personnel, that it continues on rather than not, but we'll see. James, you wanted to come in on other
one thing to add in this question of longevity and whatever else, it's worth noting that things like the investment zone strategy from the previous government haven't featured. Superficially, there were quite a lot of similarities, right? It picked sectors, it picked places. It struck me as interesting that hasn't featured in this part, and obviously we'll talk about some related issues later. If we could also add on this question of targets and everything else, there is a question of how fast you want to grow anything else, but a more basic one about convergence, right? So in our G7 report, we talked a little bit about closing and the gap between Britain and its comparative European countries. There's a question to be had about whether, as the white paper rolls around, that will come more to the fore about why are we doing this and how are we going to get there?
Yeah, that's a great point. We've got a couple of questions. So, David, to answer your question is what's the future of car manufacturing? I'm not in a position to answer that, but the industrial strategy doesn't say anything about automotive industries, which previous industrial strategies have.
Yes.
Draw from that what you will. And then, Rick, you apologise for not reading it. Don't worry, you're not the only one. And you also say, is there anything about food security in there? The answer is no. So I think this is very much focused on tradables, international competitiveness, where we can get kind of growth, however defined, but often thinking about productivity growth, etc. Very much thinking about it in an international and investment context rather than say in a domestic or localized context. I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's where the industrial strategy is. So very specific answers to yours. You're welcome, Rick. Just thank me for that. So we've talked a little bit about the good things we're a little bit worried about. Quite a bit of our analysis, which we're very pleased about, obviously, is in the white paper, in the green paper already. Hopefully, makes it into the green paper as well. But also, there's a bit of analysis, particularly around how place and industry or how place and sectors interact that we've done that might offer some more insight as we move from green to white. So, James, you were doing some of that work for us or leading it for us. Just say a little bit more around that.
Yeah, so when I think about this particular question, the relationship between sector and place, I really sort of cast my mind back and think of two bits of work that we've done over the last couple of years. One of them looking at the sort of geography of what we call new economy firms. These are businesses that sit at the frontier of their sectors, and they're very productive and innovative and all the good stuff that we like. So there's that part of work, and there's also some stuff on what we call economic complexity, which is a way of measuring places essentially by looking at how many rare, high-value things they have in their local economies. And I think sort of two things fall out of that which are of relevance to this. So the first is that success for a place, for an economy, really depends on this sort of stuff. raising the complexity of Birmingham's economy or Sheffield's economy is going to have big impacts both of those places and also nationally on things like growth and wages. And that we saw that probably one of the reasons why these economies have fallen behind is precisely because they've lost that sort of competitive edge. And the second point to make is that getting that complexity and moving your economy up the value chain really depends on diversity and co-location between these sorts of activities. Cutting edge businesses, whether they're financial firms or genetics firms or whatever it might be, benefit from the same sorts of things, right?
Yeah.
Deep pools of skilled labor, connectivity, lab or office space, and truly resilient innovation often depends on the sort of cross-pollination between these sectors, right? You get these breakthroughs that are a bit unusual and persist and move us all along a little bit when ideas are shared across sectors. And that's something that happens in a way most effectively when things are co-located together. And I think this sort of stuff is interesting, not only from our perspective and pushing along growth, but also because it shows us a little bit about how horizontal levers, as they have in the jargon, things like transport infrastructure or skills policy, can really help you get to those sort of sector outcomes that were really interesting, right? If you really want to push life sciences along, you need to think about, okay, well, what is the business environment that life science exists in alongside other innovative activities, and how can we foster that in future? So for me, those two bits of work, definitely go on our website and have a look if you're interested. I mean, a big standout part of it is, and to say it again, that when we look at how these things cluster together over very short distances, they don't do it in a sort of monocluster, sector-specific way, right? They want to share, they benefit from similar things, and that points us in a certain direction when it comes to actually implementing the industrial strategy down the line.
I mean, these things co-locate, don't they? They're all in the same place. I think it's a bit artificial then to start separating these things out, with advanced manufacturing potentially being the one exception to that.
I think so.
Particularly on the service side, the cutting edge of the economy, are going into the same places because they offer exactly the benefits that you were suggesting, James. And I think the cluster discussion and clusters comes up in the industrial strategy. You can go one of two ways. It can either sort of focus on the sector component of that, and people think about then clusters being this one sector, or it can go on the geography front. And our point is much more, it's the cluster bit, as in things do co-locate in a very small space, which is the important bit, which the artificial chunking up of sectors misses. I think what's really interesting is even when the government did its own sector work, cluster work, it then presented all these different sectors as individual maps. What it was less good at doing was actually overlaying all those sectors on the same map. And when you did that, instead of having them separate and going, oh, look, it's where this industry is located, it's where that industry is located, and put those maps together, there was huge overlap within that, which very much starts to take you from the bridge, which was one of our criticisms from, oh, well, here are just sectors, to these things locate in a similar place, which might then mean that in order to help the sectors that you want to help, thinking about where they locate and intervening in that space in terms of place might well be more effective than here's a sector deal for X and a sector deal for Y.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'd add a thought, which is something both of you just touched on, which is it's then going beyond using place as a descriptor to say basically these are the places where these things happen, which is really just a description of how the economy organizes itself, to get under the skin of that and ask questions about why the geography of the economy looks like it does. It's not random, it's not even, which we say a lot, and there are some good reasons as to why certain types of activity co-locate or locate wherever they do. Understanding those reasons and factors then gives you a better way to think about the policy levers that you might want to use in order to influence that, rather than just in a sort of a descriptor or even from an analytical point of view.
Even within one sector, right? So this is a really interesting thing about things like pharmaceuticals or advanced manufacturing, where design and scientific and research breakthroughs occur is often quite different from where a place where something would be manufactured. So if we talk about pharmaceuticals, for example, a lot of the innovation, quote unquote, is occurring in the Great Southeast, around Cambridgeshire, stuff like that. Manufacturing, which produces good jobs and is very productive, is often occurring in different parts of the country. That's fine, but working out what the balance between those things are and what interventions you want to do accordingly is going to be a really important part of getting this right.
Yeah, quite. So we've had quite a few questions in. So John, does rail appear not as an industry, but it does as an underpinning sort of foundational service that actually supports particularly the competitiveness of place. So it's where it's talked about as being one of those attributes that you need in place in order to create the deep labour pools, etc., that really help firms. I think that's quite an important point to make. Ian asks this question about regions are referred to, cities are referred to. Actually, they are all referred to in the paper. Regions really only appear in some of the headlines or headings or subheadings of in the text. Doesn't really any more than that. But there are three specific places, as it were, types of place that are referenced. One is cities, particularly big cities, as Paul has already said. Two is clusters, and I think it's kind of big clusters that they're typically thinking about. There's a place element to that, obviously, because they're bounded by geography at some level. And then the third thing is strategic industrial sites, as they refer to them, which we think could be referring to, let's say, like the green stuff that happens on the Teesside, which is industrial site orientated, or the stuff over on the defence in Barrow, which might be more industrial orientated, but often located not quite in the middle of nowhere, but you know what I mean. So there's different versions of it, but there's quite a bit of different perspectives on the place.
Yes, yeah, I think the region definitely gets less of a mention maybe than probably. Need to go back and look more detail on the 2008-9 strategy. I imagine region gets a lot of airing there. Whereas again, that's something that has evolved over time, thinking sort of beyond region, which doesn't really mean anything, more to have the economy organise itself across cities, towns, and other areas. I think that's to be welcome. Remains to be seen, I think, whether the region word starts to become more talked about, particularly in the devolution space in the future. That's something to watch separately. But in this document, at least currently, much less of an emphasis, which we think is a good thing.
Yeah, quite. Okay. So we've had a couple of other questions, and not so much for us today, but if you read the paper, it's definitely more than a paper which is about how we're going to dole out subsidy. Right, which is often where we get to what really industrial strategy means is which industries, which firms, which bits of the country are going to get a bit of cash. That's very old school approach to industrial strategy. In fairness, this one and actually the 17 one were more sophisticated, more nuanced, broader based than that, and actually thinking about the role of regulation as well as, for example, the role of investment in cash, and particularly how it then connects to the government's agenda on planning and planning reform, for example, is quite an important recognition and nod to that. It's much more than just subsidy allocation.
Yeah.
So I think that is quite important. Okay, let's touch on the third section, I suppose, that we talked about. So we've done goods and bads, done a bit of analysis. Let's just highlight some of the, I suppose, the trade-offs and or the tensions that we can see already in the way that the industrial strategy is thinking about it. And I think there's one around the role and interaction between the national and the local. In this instance, what central government wants to see happen through the industrial strategy, and the role it thinks about that it's going to have with mayors and for mayors through the local growth plans, which are referenced in the industrial strategy. And obviously you have to think about, we're also about to get a devolution white paper, which will relate to the industrial strategy, but will be slightly different. So just say a little bit about what we think is going on there, and particularly, I suppose, how this may or may not be resolved and when it needs to be resolved.
Yeah, so it makes me think back to the 2017 version where we had the national one, then local industrial strategies underneath. And a lot of the discussion on the local industrial strategies were, well, national level have set all these different grand challenges and objectives, and we need to sort of crowbar our local industrial strategy into to match that format. Now, at the national level, that may or may not work to be debated, but let's say it does work. What that national sort of blueprint then doesn't apply to every individual area because different places play different roles. And I guess there's an element of a sense even here where it's like, seems to be, the MCAs will come up with their local growth plans and they'll sort of have their sectors in there which we sort of defined, which all sort of toe along to our line. And it'll be nationally set and local areas sort of falling behind, as opposed to being a little bit more flexible about, we're trying to achieve this growth mission to be defined, needs to be more defined more clearly. Right, different areas have different roles to play in that. They will come forward with how they think they can help achieve that. And it seems a little bit, and this might be a bit unfair, it seems a little bit that sort of mayoral combined authorities and other places have been used as instruments to deliver the national strategy rather than what can you bring forwards to help the economy grow. Sort of it's that top-down element rather than allowing a bit more freedom at the local level. And through conversations we've had some frustrations, I think, from combined authorities about perhaps what that interaction has looked like, and places being told to pick out their three key sectors you got to come forward with, which is exactly what happened with the investment zones as well, where it was, we've got 5 sectors and you've got to pick one. Really, is that a framework that works? So I think there's definitely going to be a tension there about what role the local growth plans play and what role mayors are seen to play in all of this. Which, as you said, Andrew, then with devolution, we're talking about trying to give more powers to these places. Maybe they don't want to use those powers in exactly the way the national government wants them to use them. I think that's where becoming overly prescriptive at the national level, particularly in absence of having a target we want to achieve. So there's no particular target we want to hit, but then becoming overly prescriptive on the individual minutiae, I think is a difficult position we might end up finding ourselves in. And hopefully in the white paper, we might see a bit of a redressing of that.
In part because a lot of the trade-offs, and to speak of another trade-off, there's always one that always looms in industrial strategy stuff, which is the trade-off between jobs and productivity. If you have a very highly productive thing, lots of small number of very skilled workers generating a lot of value add compared to a situation where you've got lots of extra jobs in a certain industry, a lot of those trade-offs are going to play out locally. We would expect, say, Manchester or even London to be playing this sort of a high value add, high skill, high tech thing, which may not see then loads of manufacturing jobs in situ, even if it's in the same industry. Mm. And I think navigating that tension is going to be difficult for mayors who quite rightly want to say, well, we've bought into the national industrial strategy, we've got this and we've got these number of jobs. It's often not that simple, even within a national scale. So I think who has agency is going to be a really interesting thing that's going to have to be teased out.
Yeah. Yes, and exactly. And we know that some of the things that the mayors are doing in regards to, say, housing, right, or permitting commercial or enabling commercial development or improving their transport systems. We know from the evidence that actually, if you get those things working more efficiently, more effectively, they in themselves have growth effects, which is irrespective of what you actually do in a sort of classic business sense. So, enabling certain businesses to grow or to expand. We've often said in some places, the best growth policy is actually to allow more housing to be built, for example, in some places. Yeah. So trying to think about those kinds of issues and the degree to which you can do that in the industrial strategy or not. And then you run the risk of the industrial strategy becoming very, very broad. It's everything to everywhere. And then suddenly we've lost some of the prioritization and focus.
Yeah. But that shows there what the role of planning policy has got to do in all of this. And you could argue that reforming the planning system opens up so much potential opportunity that it deals with the potential of this. And then a place like Cambridge in particular, it might be the provision of housing and lab space, which is the challenge, which the planning system addresses. And then you don't need to worry about the individual sectors because the private sector then responds because those constraints have been removed. So it's understanding what that looks like and how those different strategies fit together.
Yeah, and seeing how, as we said, the industrial strategy as it evolves from green to white interacts with and references and is referenced by the devolution white paper, which we're led to believe will have, this side of Christmas, seeing how those two things interact. And whether there is a degree of interaction. I think there should be, and we hope there will be, but there will, there definitely needs to be, right?
Yeah, totally.
Absolutely.
Okay, we're rapidly running out of time, but we said we'd do it for 30 minutes. This is, our initial review. We're doing lots more on, thinking about the industrial strategy, how it evolves, what more needs to be done, taking some of the things we've talked about today and getting into the detail of that, and all of that will appear. We'll be talking more about that over the next couple of months or so. But in terms of like big takeaways, just in terms of the big takeaways we want to leave our audience with, or what is it that we particularly want to just remind them of, I suppose?
So 2 things for me. One is defining what we mean by growth. And for us, it's about closing the prosperity gap with Germany. So the goal should be trying to make us more productive than Germany over a certain period of time. You can see why we think that in our report from earlier this year, Climbing the Summit. And the second one is trying to figure out what this interaction between sector and place looks like to strengthen the rationale for why we'd have the industrial strategy, for why we'd have interventions, of which we have a lot of work on that already, and we'll continue to work on that in the coming months as well. So watch this space.
Brilliant. Final thought from you, James? Like big takeaway, big things?
we'll see how it develops, but there's lots of sensible ideas in there. It's getting this, I think, sorting out this place versus sector tension is going to be the really thing that unlocks it and really makes a success of it in the long run.
Brilliant. That's it. So it's 12:30. Let me just another plug. As I say, if you're interested in all manner of issues in relation to industrial strategy and devolution, then you should definitely come along if you're in London next Thursday, 31st of October, to listen to Greg Clark, who I said, obviously Secretary of State for both relevant departments and really led on many of the issues in relation to industrial strategy and devolution in the last Conservative government over that 14-year period. So it'll be a fascinating insight, not only to hear what he takes away from that, what he might say, but actually where he thinks now the new Labour government is and what kind of advice or insights would he offer them. So if you're about, then you can get the details on our website. And as I said, all the material we've been talking about, some of the studies and some of the report, some of the writing, some of the analysis that we've been talking about today, all available on our website. You just have to search for it. And as we do more work over the next period, then all of that at some point will appear on our website, and we'll be doing events and podcasts, etc., all about that. So for now, thanks for being with us.